we go. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's American Community Media Weekly National Briefing. I'm Pilar Marrero, your moderator for today and co-producer of American Community Media's weekly news briefings with my colleague Sunita Sorachi. 15 immigrants have died in immigration detention so far this year, 10 of them between January and June, making that period the deadliest in recent history. Some of these deaths were suicide. More than 1,200 people are allegedly missing from the infamous and controversial Everglades facility dubbed Alligator Alcatraz, with families and attorneys unable to locate them. Advocates report that children are being subjected to prolonged detention under harmful conditions, and that reports of overcrowding, unsanitary facilities, and problems with food and healthcare access are multiplying. There are currently close to 60,000 detainees, a record number, and the rapid expansion of arrests and detention combined with diminishing transparency signals a worsening situation for immigrants, many of whom have not been convicted of any crime. Our panelists today will discuss these issues and provide the best information they have available. Our panel includes Andrew Free. He's an Atlanta-based lawyer. He founded Detention Kills to support families and communities affected by deaths in DHS custody. Janet Jill, Senior Counsel for Refugee Advocacy at Human Rights First. And Heather Hogan, she's a Policy and Practice Counsel at the American Immigration Lawyers Association. We ask reporters to enter questions in the chat, and we will address as many as we can immediately after each speaker. This time, our format will allow for each panelist to present, and then we will open the floor for questions and discussions, more discussion at the end. We ask speakers to speak at a moderate pace for simultaneous interpreters in Mandarin, Spanish, and Korean. So with that, let's just start, and I'm inviting Heather Hogan to start with her presentation. Heather, welcome.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be speaking to all of you today. This is a topic that's really important to me. I think journalists' role in immigration reporting is more essential now than ever. As we know, the government is taking significant actions in immigration enforcement that will have long-term consequences for individuals, their families, and American society as a whole. So I'll focus today on my experiences working inside immigration detention facilities and solutions that Ayla, who I work for, supports. So I worked as an asylum officer with USCIS, and in that role, I worked inside of multiple detention facilities where members of the public are not allowed access. I conducted screening interviews with asylum seekers in Arizona and California, and I later supervised teams who were conducting screening interviews with asylum-seeking families in the family detention facilities in Texas. So I've talked to hundreds of detained asylum seekers, and I was frequently struck by how they're treated like incarcerated criminals, despite many, as Pilar mentioned, having no criminal record. I can describe how a typical day would start for an asylum seeker who I spoke with. So they were woken up extremely early. I was usually shocked by how early they were woken up and fed breakfast. It was maybe 3:30, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning. Okay, sorry. I just saw a question about how I
Don't worry
gained
about the
access.
questions.
Okay, later. Okay, got it. So people were woken up extremely early in the morning. So, 3:30, 4, 5 o'clock. And then by the time I talked to them, they were tired, they were hungry. And this is a really important, life-altering interview to determine if they potentially qualified for a hearing in front of an immigration judge. So in Florence, Arizona, for example, in the immigration detention facility, I would wait inside of a side door while guards unloaded buses of asylum seekers who were bussed over from a prison nearby. despite most having no criminal record. They were housed in a prison anyway. They wore orange jumpsuits, they were shackled at the wrists and the feet. So they shuffled in line to be unshackled, and then they waited in a holding cell all day until they were called for an interview one by one. While waiting, they had absolutely nothing to do, and then they were typically fed a meager meal at lunch. And then, as an example of the consistent derogatory treatment, I remember one man I was interviewing needed to use the restroom. So we asked the security guard to take him to the restroom. When the asylum seeker could not immediately find the restroom, the guard mocked him, called him names. And then when the man turned around, the guard pretended like he was kicking him, like in the seat of his pants. And then he laughed about it with the other security guards. The contract security guards and ICE officers refer to immigration detainees as bodies, which is a common term in incarcerated situations. And that's the commonplace term among DHS officials. So the system is extremely dehumanizing, and mocking detainees and referring to them as bodies are common examples. So I think it's essential that reporters continue the excellent work being done to sustain attention on this issue so the public doesn't lose focus. It's no surprise that in detention, especially prolonged detention, it causes widespread mental health issues. Many members of the public don't necessarily realize this, so I think it's important to share. A lot of asylum seekers, most asylum seekers, frankly, already have had really traumatizing experiences before they ever come to the US. Detention then exacerbates their trauma. Some people have conditions already that get worse, and some develop conditions because of being detained. There's little access to mental health support. As another example, I interviewed somebody who was kidnapped at the Guatemala-Mexico border and then held in a brothel and forced to do sex work. This person escaped after about 9 months and made it on their own to the US. I also talked to people whose family members were murdered by gang members and cartels, people whose governments have persecuted them, including through imprisonment. So these people flee to the US for safety, and then they're put back in detention. For the most vulnerable, the practices are very concerning. So those contemplating suicide or people who attempt suicide, they're often put in solitary confinement. And this is similar for members of the LGBTQI plus community. Sometimes, like transgender applicants, for example, HIV positive individuals, they were also placed in solitary confinement. And that was purportedly for their own protection, according to the government. However, I was reminded looking at a piece recently that, at a certain period of time, the UN classifies solitary confinement as torture. And then, also in my own experience, a young woman who one of my asylum officer colleagues had interviewed for a credible fear interview, she committed suicide just like a few days after the credible fear interview. So that was really distressing. I think this was in Eloy, Arizona, if I remember correctly. So the safeguards and oversight are sorely lacking, and that's something I don't have a ton of time to go into, but I can certainly we can talk about it further in questions. Just as an example, California maybe has more protections than many states. They have a state law mandating Attorney General oversight and a report annually. So the most recent report published in April of this year found that facilities continue to fall short in basic mental health care. There are gaps in suicide prevention and treatment. There are use of force incidents against mentally ill detainees. And now we know that the federal government, by its own statements, is using detention to induce immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers to give up on their cases and leave the US. The government is trying to maximize the punitive nature of detention and make the conditions so difficult that people would rather leave than pursue relief. AILA member attorneys are reporting that clients are moved from facility to facility, often to parts of the US where their clients know no one and have no resources. So it's very difficult to represent them in those circumstances. Just in the past week, a member attorney reported on a client who decided to give up on her habeas petition requesting release from detention because she mentally was breaking down. So Ayla promotes, not using detention for families at all, and has publicly emphasized that deprivation of liberty is a power that should be used rarely and only when absolutely necessary. Ayla promotes community-based alternatives, so case management services and legal representation provided by the government. And Ayla also has an excellent featured issue page with a lot of resources about this that I'd be happy to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. I know that these kinds of conditions have been talked about for years. It's not just during the Trump
Right.
administration, but what is the difference between what's happening this year and what's been happening before? Is there a difference?
There definitely is a difference. I think right now we know that cruelty is the point. So separating people from their families, taking them away from their communities, the trauma is the point to get people to leave the United States. We're told that people at the border are being told like there is no more asylum, and this is, Trump's government, there's no asylum, things like that. And so I think that one of the big differences that's really alarming to me is that the cruelty and the dehumanization is now being sort of encouraged by the federal government, in my view, whereas before, under administrations who were more concerned with human rights and with the rule of law, they did try to take actions and hold officers accountable. I don't think that that's happening anymore.
All right. Okay. Pamela, do you want to ask your question? Pamela Anshan, and identify your media organization, please.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Pilar, and thank you for that presentation, Heather. It's so heartbreaking because it hits home so closely to some of us. Most of us are immigrants. My name is Pamela. I'm the founder of the Immigrant magazine, and it's exactly for these kinds of purposes that we do what we do. And I'm just curious to know, though, with all the hideousness and the dehumanizing of asylum seekers, and refugees, and immigrants in detention, what can we as a community do to support the families and push for accountability? It can't be that there are no options and no ways to hold the system accountable. What can families do, and what can communities and allies do to alleviate
I
this?
think Oh, sure. Thank you so much for the question. I think it's really key to keep publicly sharing the individual stories. As journalists, I know that you know that the personal nature of incidents like really resonates with people, and when it's people in their own communities, they mobilize, I think, a lot more than just hearing, statistics and numbers and things. So I think that like honing in on individual stories and what's happening, especially inside of detention, because I think a lot of people just really don't think about it. I think they don't understand. I think they don't know how long people end up detained and the types of conditions that they're held in, because I think that it's often viewed as like we're America. Of course we wouldn't do this to people, right? Whereas a lot of the things that are happening now are things that happen in other places that don't respect human rights in the same way that the US, our values like we want to, in the way that we typically try to. So I think really elevating those stories and just continuing to focus and not shying away from some of the really, really difficult things like the solitary confinement and the fact that it can constitute torture, and the fact that it's being done to really vulnerable people and their backstories that show why this is such a detrimental thing to do to them.
Thank you. Thank you, Heather. Let's see, more questions. There was a question by Henrietta Burrows. Can you ask your question, Henrietta?
Yes, thanks, Pilar. How were you able to get the interviews inside the detention centers? I mean, what are the guidelines and the regulations? And also, what is the general outcome for most asylum seekers under those conditions?
Thanks. It was part of my job. I worked for U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services as an asylum officer. So when people requested asylum and they were detained, then me and my colleagues, our job was to go into detention facilities and conduct credible fear interviews with them. And so those are interviews that are required by law, and the regulations require that a trained asylum officer does those interviews. And so these are interviews to screen to see if they're eligible for a court hearing where they'll have their asylum case more fully fleshed out. So we were allowed to access the facilities in order to do those interviews as government officials. And that's why I was able to go into places where the public can't go, because I was, at the time, I was a government official myself.
And
Well, and
the outcome for most asylum seekers?
Oh, yes. The outcome. So previously, the bar for credible fear interviews, it's the bar to establish eligibility for a hearing is low. It's intentionally low so as to cast a wide net and not, remove asylum seekers who may be eligible for protection. So when I was doing interviews, I would say that many, I couldn't give an exact figure, but I would say that many asylum seekers would pass that first interview and be found to have like a positive, credible fear was how it was referred to as like positive or negative. I think in part just because of the conditions they were coming from and the circumstances and the situations they fled. Often we found that it potentially qualified them for protection. At this time, I don't think that the cases are going in applicants' favor as much because there have been under both the Biden administration and now under, well, it was Trump 1.0, then Biden, and now there have been a lot more like bars to applying for asylum, such as like requiring them to request asylum in the, country that they passed through on the way here without, even though that doesn't acknowledge that a lot of countries people go through don't have really functioning like asylum systems. In Mexico, for example, it's still not a terribly high capacity asylum system. So there are lots of bars that have been put in place to even applying. I think that officers are given a lot of directives to make the bar higher than it was intended by Congress to be.
thank you, Heather. I'm going to move on to next speaker, but stay around so we can
Of
maybe
course.
ask more questions of you later.
Thank you.
So I'm welcoming Andrew Free. He's an Atlanta-based lawyer. I'm sure he can tell us a lot about the current situation in detention centers. Andrew.
Thank you, Pilar. So as Pilar noted, I've been working with families and communities in responding to deaths in ICE custody since May of 2017. That's when I was contacted by the immigration lawyer and family of Jean Jimenez, who died at the Stewart Detention Center by suicide. The Stewart Detention Center is the deadliest facility in the United States for the last 8 fiscal years. But when I began, I started where many of you may be starting, which is with only kind of like an amorphous understanding of this problem, of the history and interventions that have happened in the past, and of where we are in the current context. So it took me a long time to sort of get schooled up on where we've been. I've put a number of resources in the chat just now with links that should help you if you want to start to learn about this. But I'm just going to talk to you very briefly about where we are in terms of morbidity and mortality in ICE custody this year. Oops, excuse me, sorry, that's the wrong sheet. Since I started doing this, I've moved out of the active practice of immigration law and civil rights law to journalism, and I now write stories about this, and I spend a lot of time helping other journalists and publications report out stories about this. You should see a sheet that says officially acknowledged deaths in ICE custody by fiscal year. Okay, great. So as Pilar said, this is a deadly time. It's the deadliest year in ICE detention since COVID. At the end of the fiscal year, which ended on Tuesday, we had 22 deaths in ICE custody. That's the second highest level ever on record, exceeded only by deaths in custody in fiscal year 2004. One of the very common phenomena as a result of the patchwork of information that ICE maintains about deaths in custody is that it's very hard for people like us who are in the business of information sharing and public education and hopefully teaching people something so that they'll change their minds. It's very hard for us to get authoritative information in one place. So that's I've put into the chat this ICE deaths tiny URL, and it's actually 19 people since the beginning of the year who've died in ICE custody. I maintain this database. I publish it on the web. It's going to be imported into a university hopefully fairly soon, but I try and keep access to at least the ICE press release announcement and then giving some basic demographic information so that people like you are able to turn to an easy source of reference that helps you not have to spend the time that most people spend initially getting schooled up on this stuff. And so that the stories are in context and we have sufficient historical understanding of where we are in this moment. During fiscal year 2025, we had, like I said, 22 deaths. Most of them happened in Florida. Not most, but the largest number happened in Florida. That was mostly at Chrome or within the Miami field office. That was a particularly overcrowded and understaffed area. And we had women sleeping in buses in the parking lot and people dying as a consequence. Texas was the second largest. We note that despite the fact that Louisiana has some of the highest detention populations, Louisiana had no deaths in custody, which is interesting to me. So yeah, this is over time. So from fiscal year '04 to 2025, these are the publicly reported locations. So to give you an idea, although there were the second highest numbers of deaths in custody, it's actually not the deadliest per population. ICE's average daily population exceeded 61,000 this previous fiscal year. So it's the number of people who are in an ICE facility overnight, according to the government's official numbers. And what I've done is I've taken it's the Stewart Detention Center. And this year, Chrome was the one, as Heather noted. So what I've done is I've taken the average daily population for all the data we have going back to 2001 and the publicly acknowledged deaths in custody. I'm going to put a pin in publicly acknowledged and come back to it. And we see that actually ICE morbidity and mortality has been reduced significantly since its height in 2013, when 13 out of every 10,000 people who went in ICE custody would die. We hit an all-time low in fiscal year 2022 when only 3 people died in custody. That was no doubt linked to the fact that population in ICE custody was also at a near all-time low. So how does this compare? This compares, you should be able to see now the BOP rate. And the Bureau of Prisons rate of morbidity and mortality is significantly higher. We have more people in the Bureau of Prisons, the BOP, Bureau of Prisons. We have more people who are dying of old age there because they're serving life sentences. That's not the case in ICE, but we do see the mortality rate going up. What do we know about the people who've died? I've kept and broken down a pivot table of the citizenship information for the people who've died in custody. 1 in 5 people who die in ICE custody over time have been from Mexico. Cuba has been the second largest population, citizenship population to die. And this year is similar. Leah, to your point, we'd have to use a proxy because some people who might be recorded as Black may also be Hispanic. I'm seeing this question in the chat: what percentage of Hispanics in the detention center? So Jean, for instance, Jean's family's from Panama, but they're also like Black and Colombian. So how would we record that in terms of ethnicity and race? I would call Jean Hispanic ethnically and racially Black. But ICE doesn't keep this data, or at least they don't publish it. So coming back to the pin that I just dropped in reported deaths, I've put into the chat a link to the field guide on my Substack. It's this document, Field Guide to Documenting Deaths in ICE Detention, which lays out like the various sources of information that people in the business of disseminating it can go to understand like what is ICE saying, what are the official numbers. And the place to go first to understand what's happening is to ICE's newsroom, and you can sort by detainee death notifications, and that's where they put out the information. A lot of people will try to go to the detainee death reporting page for ICE, but it's not the same thing, and this is a big misconception. So there's about a 10-minute video on the Substack that I have pinned so that people can come back to it and understand sort of where we're. Um, so yeah, this question of like, do we believe ICE's numbers? We've had this very incredible addition to our space in the last year. The Deportation Data Project has been litigating and obtaining numbers of a lot of information about ICE custody, and they've also very helpfully compiled information, historical data that other people have obtained, and they've credited those scholars and journalists and media outlets with having obtained that information. And so what I've been able to do with this information, particularly the detentions and detainers information, is I've been able to test using the filters in these spreadsheets to see whether people whose detention release reason, so that's this column H, is listed as died, are also listed in the official ICE death publications, which I've put here, and that's at the tinyurl.com/ICE deaths. And what I concluded after comparing these two things is that there are at least 5 people who died in fiscal year 2025, according to ICE, who are not in the death announcements. Now, I have my suspicions about the accuracy of this data. I think maybe somebody in the Montgomery hold room has fat fingers because they've got a detention release reason has died, but their stay release reason is transferred. So maybe somebody in this Montgomery hold room in Texas accidentally entered data, and it's just not correct, right? That doesn't explain why we would have this information in Florence or in Otero, and it doesn't explain why all of the columns, detention release and stay release, are died for other people. This is frustrating for people because this year there have been a number of reports of people dying in ICE custody that are unreported by ICE. I'm investigating a few myself. Other reporters have published about them. And it's bringing us back to the point that we were at historically, back when we're talking about, up to 29 deaths in a fiscal year. If you read the work that I would highly recommend if you're thinking about doing any work on this, like in depth, this work, Death in Custody by Roger Mitchell, who was formerly the chief medical examiner for the District of Columbia, and Jay Aronson, who runs a human rights clinic at Carnegie Mellon in Pennsylvania, they describe the situation that we're dealing with as nationally, not just in the ICE detention context, as being akin to the one that Ida B. Wells was dealing with when she was trying to report on lynchings. There's this intentional ignorance that's imposed upon us by a system that knows when people die because they have to move the bodies out. And that intentional ignorance, it has political consequences and political value for the people who maintain it. ICE is actually, believe it or not, and I hate to say this, and I'm sure one of you I prefer not to be quoted on it, but I did not say we're off the record and I don't know our terms. ICE is actually comparatively better than a lot of the prison and jail systems in the United States. ICE tells us when a person dies and they produce a report, and then they release that report subject either to affirmative releases or the Freedom of Information Act. What I've found through the Deportation Data Project, and this is the last thing I'll say because I'm conscious of our time. What I found through the Deportation Research Project, detainers data. So these are people who have been subject to an ICE detainer. That's a request from ICE to a local, state, or federal custodian that they want to pick the person up at the end of their custody period. I found hundreds, over 400 unreported deaths dating back to fiscal year '09. And there's a gap for the entire Trump administration in that data if you go to the Deportation Research Clinic or Deportation Data Project website. And then when I tried to cross-reference the states where death reporting is mandatory, so California, Texas, Illinois, places where you must report a death in custody, I did not find those people who died. So what I fear is there are people who are dying in state or local custody whose deaths are never being reported publicly and they're never being investigated and recorded. And so what is the true number of people dying in ICE custody? I don't actually know. And I don't think anybody does. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, for all of that. Let me call on, let's see. Okay, there was a question initially about number of people detained. You mentioned 61,000, I believe. We've seen an expansion during this administration. We've seen them use more places to detain people, like temporary offices to detain people longer. What can you tell us about this expansion and how it has changed things and conditions?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of observations. The first is that the Vera Institute put out a data product earlier today that actually exposes ICE using more than 460 sites of detention, including local custodial settings, medical centers, and other like hold rooms. But in its official detention statistics, which are published on the ICE website every 2 weeks, according to federal appropriations laws, they only list about 180 the last time I checked. So there are a bunch of shadow sites. We would call these black sites if it were any other country. And the nature of these sites is also particularly troubling because when you're not in a detention like a statistical reporting system, you're probably also not in the ICE detainee locator. And that has what my colleagues have referred to the consequence of enforced disappearances. So you mentioned in South Florida, we've got folks who we don't know where they are. And combined with the custodial settings that are being activated, which are very often repurposed prisons with little to no retrofitting to make the conditions of confinement truly civil. You're just in a prison. And in California City, for instance, there's been some really great reporting that, this is the worst place anybody's been, and many of them are sentence servers. They've already served time in state prison. You've got detentions on Fort Bliss. You've got detentions at Angola. And so the reason that civil immigration detainees don't get a constitutional right to an attorney, a jury, a speedy trial, prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment, and a number of other confrontation, the exclusionary rule. There's a bunch of different constitutional rights that civil immigration detainees do not enjoy. And the facade is it's because they're only civil infractions and they're not being punished. And that goes back to the Chinese Exclusion Act cases in the late 1880s, 1890s. But the conditions of confinement are functionally indistinguishable from prisons.
Araceli Martinez from La Opinión, you want to ask your question?
Hello.
Araceli? Hi, go ahead.
Yes, I was wondering what has been the problem, because we have seen a lot of lawsuits have been filed in the last year trying to correct these abuses that we have seen in specifically in Adelanto, but nothing good had come from those lawsuits. So, and these abuses, as Pilar mentioned it before, are not new, but under Trump, of course, has been intensified. What can we do? Why all these efforts have not been? We have not been any results of these. Can you please comment on this?
Sure. I'm probably the wrong person to ask because I left the law because I felt like it was too ineffective at getting people in motion what they deserved in terms of justice. That being said, I will tell you that lawsuits effectively depopulated the ICE detention system during COVID and resulted in the release of over 50,000 human beings, many of whom would have died had they been in ICE custody. So that number that I cited at fiscal year 2022, that number of just three people, is a result of litigation, some of which used the information we obtained from ICE on behalf of families of people who had died to show that ICE was violating their medical standards, because we already had that information. I would also say that the whole reason we know any of this is a combination of reporting and litigation under the Freedom of Information Act during the aughts, during the Bush administration and the first term of Obama. The only reason we have this information about how many people are dying is because the ACLU sued for it in 2008, and the New York Times wrote a scathing expose about cover-ups. And so the problem with lawsuits and the problem with law in general is people go to courts and they go to law school and they go to law firms for justice, and what we give them is law, and they're not the same. Most of the most I would say horrific abuses that we've seen in this country's history and worldwide have been legal. So going to court for justice is very difficult. What I think is more hopeful is the idea that by educating people through media and through the free press and through fact-based, evidence-based reporting and through narratives where people's stories come to life and they're not statistics, we can change people's minds. And I've seen that happen.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to call in the next panelist, and then we're going to have more questions for everyone. Janet Kill is with Human Rights First. And Janet, welcome.
Thank you, Pilar, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone. As she said, my name is Yana Gill with Human Rights First, an independent advocacy organization which challenges America to live up to its ideals. We do this through various mechanisms: litigation, advocacy, grassroots organizing, and for nearly 50 years, Human Rights First has been a leader in asylum advocacy, primarily partnering with pro bono attorneys to represent thousands in their asylum claims, but also through research of conditions on the border, advocating in Capitol Hill, and conducting oversight of immigration detention centers. It's with that said mission that we're expressing our grave concern around the lack of transparency that we've seen, which is very, very unique to the Trump administration 2.0. And of course, following up on the multiple deaths that have been reported. So I'll be discussing not just the conditions surrounding access to detention centers in 2025, but the continued rise in this use of third-party country agreements, as well as the deterioration of our asylum system due to the actions of both Congress and the administration. So congressional oversight to detention centers is not just the common practice of Homeland Security for decades now, but it's also constitutionally guaranteed. So blocking a sitting member of Congress, as we've seen documented on camera multiple times this year, is not just in violation of the Constitution, but it should feel wrong. It should make all of us stop and think, what exactly is it that Secretary Noem and ICE is hiding behind those walls? Human Rights First sought to look into just this following the death of Mr. Shou Fengji, a 32-year-old Chinese national in the Moshannon Detention Center, the largest detention center in the Northeast. This happened in August, and at the time, it was the 12th death reported. We sent in the requisite paperwork as a relevant stakeholder and were denied. We then sought the help of Representative Summerlee and Representative Mary Gay Scanlon, and they were denied. It was but for an hour, sitting outside in the middle of, try not to be disparaging, but in a very remote location of Pennsylvania, that we received a letter from ICE stating that due to threats and surges on assaults on ICE officials, that but for requests made at least a week in advance, that organizations like Human Rights First would not be allowed in. This was a lie. As shared, our organization submitted our request, following all of the requisite laws, 2.5 weeks before we arrived. And as stated, the Constitution guarantees members of Congress to conduct oversight, and all of us were denied. Our account is not unique. The ACLU of Pennsylvania has reported similar stories trying to gain access to Moshannon. And as all of you know, a sitting member of Congress was assaulted outside of Delaney Hall in New Jersey. Representative McIver, along with several other members of Congress, were denied access. None of these stories are unique. They not only violate our Constitution, But again, as I shared, call into question what are happening with these conditions that are causing folks to take their own life and others to die in custody. So, Human Rights First, based on our interactions in previous administrations, has some semblance of an idea, as I'm sure all of you have seen through reporting. There are rampant human rights violations, well documented, of inhumane, unnecessary, and unlawful conditions of migrants and asylum seekers. Our reports cite evidence of medical neglect, physical and psychological mistreatment, denial of legal counsel, and prolonged detention in unsafe and unsanitary conditions. Medical neglect is something often as simple as denying access to regular primary care, asthma attacks, maternal care, which leads to preventable deaths, which have been well documented over the administrations in the United States. Detainees have faced physical, sexual, and psychological mistreatment at the hands of staff. There's been reports of racist statements, attacks, verbal abuse, as well as the punitive use of solitary confinement, as has been shared earlier. Some people have been subjected to being held incommunicado, disappeared, and left without access to not just counsel, but their family, which I'll go into the third-party agreements a little later in the presentation. And then last but not least, of course, the lack of access to counsel. Not only is it very intentionally placed, it being detentions across our country in very remote locations that often don't have airport access, that often require long and winding roads, hours away from any major cities. But even if you are to arrive, as we experienced in August and times before, just this year alone, even if you do make the journey to get to these detentions, whether it be as lawyers or as just advocates or as family members, there's still so much procedural tape that makes gaining access to these detainees nearly impossible. And what is unique with this administration is just the brazen disregard of members of Congress, elected officials, even being gained access. So we really are, from a human rights standpoint, in a really treacherous moment when it comes to not just the conditions that are leading to these deaths, which are preventable, but also any form of oversight, whether it be from organizations like Human Rights First or the government itself. This all violates international law. It does not just our domestic law, but international law. International authorities have repeatedly condemned the United States for the practice of jailing migrant families and has urged us to end these policies. International law also prohibits the detention of immigrant children, as it's fundamentally inconsistent with the best interests of a child. And we are seeing not just the deportation of U.S. nationals, children of undocumented individuals, but also a direction moving towards a return to family detention here in Washington, D.C. Further, as it pertains to asylum seekers, it is generally prohibited under international law, except as measures of last resort to hold these people in detention, something the Trump administration has been doing with impunity. Given the availability of effective and humane alternative, detention is supposed to be a rarely permissible last resort, and that's just been completely and totally inconsistent as we see the continued attacks on access to asylum and our refugee system writ large being assaulted. Given time, I'm going to jump down a little bit to the disappearances and how that's impacting not just migrants, but U.S. nationals as well. You see, due process is at the core of this. And what we're seeing are protections to non-citizens facing potential torture and third country removals, having their rights completely and totally disregarded. Again, with very little oversight. This is where things become a little bit more political than legal. Because of the characterization of all of these individuals being deported as the quote-unquote worst of the worst, as quote-unquote terrorists, as quote-unquote members of cartels, it creates a very murky, gray, and a legal fact pattern with which we're operating, where regular constitutional rights that are guaranteed to anyone within our country are removed under the guise of a war, under the guise of fighting against some sort of criminal enterprise. It doesn't matter how many times and how many examples we've demonstrated, both in the public sphere and in Congress, our rights are continually being attacked, not just through the courts, but through these third-party disappearances. The US has sent hundreds of Venezuelans to the now notorious prison of Sicot in El Salvador. Venezuelans are not the only ones, unfortunately. There have been immigrants in Sicot from Afghanistan, Russia, Iran, China. These people have also been sent to Costa Rica and Panama. Paraguay recently signed a third-party country agreement with the Trump administration as well. And while Mexico has not signed an agreement, we have documented that they've accepted deportees from Central America and other Western countries to include Cuba, Haiti, and Venezuela. These agreements are now growing in African nations as well. As many of you may know, Ghana, Eswatini, Rwanda, and South Sudan have established some form of third-party agreements with the Trump administration. Uganda has also agreed to deal with the United States, taking particular deported immigrants, despite not having received any due to recent or per recent reports. Unfortunately, this is only the beginning. Due to the passage of the reconciliation bill, which many of you know is the big, beautiful bill, $150 billion has been given to supercharge these policies. This is not just going to fund the continued ICE raids that are happening in the interior of the country, but it's also likely to fund more disappearances. This would include folks seeking asylum in our country, more masked agents in our courtrooms, in our neighborhoods, our churches, more assaults of journalists trying to conduct oversight in places where human rights organizations and our congressmen cannot. Specifically, $45 billion have been given to expand immigration jails for families and adults. So this truly is just the beginning. To facilitate conversation and also allow for time, I'll end with this. In 1939, the United States notoriously denied 900 folks, Jewish refugees, aboard a boat. Some of you may recall the MS St. Louis from your civics classes. The grand majority of those rejected individuals were murdered by the Nazis. This is 75 years ago, where the Refugee Convention was signed into law, the one that really is the foundation of access to asylum in the United States. And yet 75 years ago, just this year, 12,000 people who already went through the immigration process and were approved refugees had their flights booked to enter into the United States, were denied access in the weeks following the Trump administration. They were told initially they would be in limbo, a mega pause, if you will. I'm now speaking to you all in October, and those individuals are still not in the United States, in violation of not just our laws, but international law. Who have been able to come are white Afrikaners, upending our essential principles to anyone within the refugee system. These threats that cause people to leave their home continue in various nations outside of South Africa. But we're seeing a reprise of a 9/11 sentiment where human and civil rights are taking the back burner under the guise of fighting terror. I'm sure many of you heard the chilling speech to our military forces earlier this year, where our president stated, you're going to go to jail, or you're going to go back where you came from, or perhaps even further than that. That last point is what I want to leave you with. It was a wink at the continued use of these third-party country agreements. It was a wink at the terror that's happening in Sicot. It was a wink at what is to come. And if we don't look back at our country's history with a pragmatism of what we have been capable of in the guise of immigration protection, in the guise of national security, we're doomed to repeat it. I'll stop there and welcome any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Janet. There was a question in the chat about whether there was a recourse maybe in the international arena. Is there a way to force the US government to bring back some transparency to this, or there's not?
So force is the tricky word in the question. So yes, there are definitely international mechanisms that Human Rights First and other partner organizations have been using. Just earlier this year, we, along with some of our partner organizations, met before the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, highlighting the continued attacks on our refugee system and the notorious conditions of our immigration detention. With this, we get oversight. We were pleasantly surprised to see that the Trump administration sent some attorneys to speak with us on the other side, which says that they're paying attention to international mechanisms. The response from the Trump administration could be described as nothing more than propaganda. And that's the part that becomes very difficult when utilizing international mechanisms. It becomes a he said, she said, where the Trump administration is saying that they are doing everything in accordance with the law, that deaths will happen, that the numbers aren't as bad as Andrew shared before, and that they're doing everything within the law to allow for us to gain access, gain oversight, that migrants are not entitled to attorneys. So the short answer is yes, there are ways in which we can utilize the United Nations or some of these regional bodies to continue to combat what's happening. But as I shared, looking at US history, force is nowhere near the verb that I would utilize. It's another tool to allow for oversight and allow for some political pressure to allow for us in the human rights space to do our job, or at a minimum for a family member to be able to see a detained individual without impunity.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I want to go to the other panelists and just ask them what they think will be the impact of this new money that is going to be pouring into, 45 billion to expand immigration jails, 150 billion in general for immigration enforcement. Going back to Heather, for example, Heather, what can you say to that? What do you expect to happen when all of that money and all of that expansion goes into place?
I think without intervention, any other intervention, from Congress or courts, it seems like the money will be used to just expand the use of detention nationwide. I would imagine that there will be a lot more, local jails and state prisons used for immigration detention because of, funding. For example, like if a county is in need of additional funds, that's a great way to get additional funding, right? It's really expensive and to detain people, and I think that they could ask for a lot of money for the use of their facilities. So if the administration carries out the plans that it's articulated it wants to, I think that we're only going to see the use of detention for immigration enforcement expand. And I think that it's really troubling because there aren't consistent standards that are used in these different facilities. Like Andrew mentioned, ICE facilities actually, comparatively speaking, are more accountable than and have better conditions than the Bureau of Prisons imagine some county jails in more isolated parts of the country. Where I grew up in the Midwest, the county I'm from, the county jail is now newly detaining immigration detainees, and it's a place that's not easy to get to. So which, Yannick mentioned is also really problematic for oversight purposes. So that's what I foresee happening is just the expansion into a lot of different types of facilities with like really inconsistent, standards.
Thank you. Andrew, what do you
Yeah,
think will happen?
I don't know. I've stopped predicting because I have not liked my predictions when they've come true. I knew for a long time that Trump was going to be reelected, and I knew that this was going to be the outcome. I would point you to the National Security Policy Memo 7 that I've put into the chat. 45 billion in detention space is more than they need to detain the folks in the United States who are non-citizens, who are subject to removal. My guess is that it is going to start, some of these facilities are going to start being used to detain people they're labeling terrorists and dissidents and insurgents in some form of quasi-military internment. Um, and the rapidity with which civil society has rolled over to the idea that you can be labeled a terrorist and pre-crimed for your opposition to quote unquote traditional Christian American values and capitalism um, probably accelerates that process. We win nothing by being silent, and we only lose by refusing to fight.
Thank you. Thank you. Janik?
Yes, I couldn't agree with Andrew more. When we look at immigration policy, one of the biggest disservices that we're doing is to think that it's strictly an immigrant issue, or that it's even more strictly a Latino issue. And Trump is taking advantage on this and capitalizing it. What we've seen through these recent executive orders is that this term of quote unquote terrorist is truly just ideological, and it is grounded within white supremacy. We have seen organizations and individuals who have spoken out against Palestine, BLM, Black Lives Matter, excuse me, LGBTQIA plus rights, and most recently, the death of Charlie Kirk, all end up within the purview of the Trump administration. So it is not hyperbolic when we talk about the potential use of these immigration detention centers. There will be popped up across our nation because it's billions of dollars, primarily without earmarks, potentially being utilized against enemies of the state. There were quotes there, enemies of the state, anyone that is against the Trump administration. So what I forecast is increased rates that truly have nothing to do with immigration. We've seen the Trump administration, excuse me, focus on any sort of blue states or blue cities. Why are there National Guard troops in Memphis, in Portland? The same reason they were here in DC. It's intimidation and political intimidation. We're going to continue to see attacks on refugee law and the lack of a pathway to asylum in violation with both international and domestic law. As I shared, this is just the beginning. There are talks here in Washington, D.C. of a second reconciliation package. We are still in the middle of appropriation season. So while it's very easy to dismiss the chaos of Capitol Hill as a circus, there are real implications coming out of these debates, real implications that go far beyond the immigration rights movement that will ultimately impact our civil and human rights, regardless of our nationality.
Thank you. There were many questions in the chat that we can get to or that had, other issues that mixed into them. So you can always, colleagues, reach out to the speakers after and ask these questions. But now I just thank you, all of you, for speaking here for us and for shedding light on this important issue and for spending 1 hour of your valuable time talking to our media. Thank you so much.